From the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, this is Environmental Focus, insight and analysis from the people shaping Pennsylvania's environmental future.
In focus this month, the Pennsylvania capital budget. Earlier this month, Governor Tom Wolf submitted his first budget of his new administration to the General Assembly. What does it do for environmental programs? And what of the billion-dollar severance tax on natural gas drilling? Will it help or hurt Pennsylvania? We'll be joined by the former Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, David Hess. Also joining us in our roundtable, John Dawes from the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, Harry Campbell of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and David Woodwell of the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, all in this month's Environmental Focus. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Governor Wolf sent his 2015 budget up to Capitol Hill in Harrisburg this month, and as expected, it's drawn both political praise and criticism, mostly over a mix of increased tax revenues and tax cuts. Joining us to break down the numbers is someone who knows the state budget process well, and the ins and outs of environmental program funding. He's David Hess, former Secretary of DEP under Governor Tom Ridge, and now the Director of Policy and Communications at Creasy Associates in Harrisburg. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us. So what were you looking for in Governor Wolf's first budget, and more importantly, did you find it?
Well, I think for the first budget, given that the state has a $2 billion budget deficit or so, we weren't looking for miracles. We were looking for some initial steps. We learned a little bit more about the severance tax on natural gas production that the governor proposed the week before. DEP is going to get, the Department of Environmental Protection is going to get some additional funds to help finance 50 more inspectors for the natural gas program. Part of the revenue will be devoted to creating a new bond issue for alternative energy efficiency, and natural gas expansion in certain circumstances. So we learned a lot, but not all yet of the details. I think the other couple things we wanted to see was there's been a controversy over using oil and gas revenues from drilling in state parks and forests for administrative costs, personnel costs, and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. We got a down payment on that to help wean that agency off those royalties, so that was good. In the past, the state has been in a financial condition where they had to or did take monies from the recycling fund, storage tanks, you name it, they took it and helped balance the budget with those monies. We didn't see any of that in this budget, so that was good. I think the one area where we're still looking for more details is in the area of water programs, particularly Chesapeake Bay protection and cleanup. We're facing a number of milestones there. Most recently coming up is 2017. So if we don't get our act together, we're going to miss that milestone. And we didn't see a down payment on that in this budget yet, although a plan is promised.
Do you think there's time between now and 2017 to make a more significant impact in that down payment?
Well, we know the things that work. We've been at this for 30 years, and we know the things that work. The agricultural best management practices, things like soil, stream buffers, and other techniques. We know things that work. If we ramp up some of those things, we're going to be in a much better position to meet those milestones.
A lot has been said about the severance tax on natural gas drilling, $1 billion tax. And Governor Wolf campaigned on the promise that he would, in fact, enact such a tax. In his budget, he lays out $10 million for environmental programs. Now, the natural gas industry has already said that they are already paying about $3 billion a year in taxes. And that an additional tax is going to make Pennsylvania less competitive with some of its neighboring gas-producing states. And in western Pennsylvania, there's a lot of attention being paid to this methane cracker plant in Beaver County. What's your take on the severance tax, and will it really help or hurt Pennsylvania?
Well, the other wrinkle is that drillers are now paying what they call a drilling impact fee that generates about $225 million a year. And the governor's proposal, at least initially, they said that part of that may be retained for local grants, to fund local grants to counties and municipalities that are in drilling areas, as well as some of the other environmental programs under there. So the severance tax is on top of that. But things aren't exactly clear yet, so we're still waiting for some more details. I think politically, I think there's going to be a lot of questions in budget hearings about exactly what are the details, who's going to be paying what, and where exactly is the money going, and we don't have all those details yet. But I think it's going to be some tough sledding. I mean, leadership, Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House have already said that.
Do you think the severance tax can survive that kind of political attention, given the the opposition it's likely to face from the industry?
Well, the severance tax is one of several tax increases that the governor is proposing, and personal income tax, sales tax, and some other things. And there's got to be some real horse trading there if those proposals get through. So in the context of things, this budget is a heavy lift because you're asking people to vote for essentially 3 or 4 different tax increases. So it's going to be very difficult. But you know, in Harrisburg they do a lot of horse trading, so we'll have to see.
Obviously things are highly politically charged in Harrisburg right now. Liquor privatization, education funding, the pension fund deficit. How intact are environmental programs likely to come out after all of the horse trading is done?
Well, I think environment is always important, and you know, shouldn't be a political issue, partisan political issue, but obviously it is. I think one of the things that's going to happen in Harrisburg is the Republicans in the House and the Senate are going to pass their own budget and put it on the governor's desk and ask him to take it or leave it. And I think obviously if it doesn't include some of the key things that he was interested in, he'll veto it, just like Governor Rendell did in his first budget when he took office. So I think it's going to be a tough slog. I think the outline of the basic environmental funding, I think that's in place now, will go forward. But if we want to address some of the other issues like Chesapeake Bay, clean water initiatives, abandoned mine reclamation, then there's going to be some heavy lifting involved in that too.
Okay. You've been around Harrisburg a long time, and you've seen how the budget process works and how a lot of the horse trading gets done. If you had to guess, what do you think is likely to happen?
Well, number one, you're not going to have an on-time budget by July 1. Isn't possible. So I think this could drag on for several months after that. And I think some of these things will get through. But you have to remember, even on the Republican side, they are not monolithic. They haven't agreed on things like pension reform, liquor privatization, some of these other things. Even the Republican proposal to provide property tax relief by getting rid of school property taxes. So that's an awful lot of stuff to do in a fairly short period of time. But they can do it if they want to. But I think this is going to be a back and forth that'll go on some time.
Okay. Well, Dave Hess, thanks very much for being here. We appreciate your insight, and I think we're going to have you back to look at the budget in the next couple of months. When we come back, we'll talk more about the state budget proposal with our roundtable. John Dawes of the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, Harry Campbell of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and David Woodwell of the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. Stay with us.
Clean, healthy air. Clear, pure water. And a landscape where families and friends can experience the incredible beauty of Pennsylvania. They're all part of the promise of Pennsylvania, a promise we must keep for generations to come.
Managing the challenges facing Pennsylvania's water resources, its demand for clean energy, a healthy climate, and outdoor recreation is what we do every day. We believe in the promise of Pennsylvania as an environmental and conservation leader and a showcase for the world. It's a promise that includes benefits for human health, the environment, the economy, and the quality of life for everyone who lives, works, and visits here. That promise is our legacy, and we hope that you will join us in making that happen.
So, Governor Wolf's budget calls for increased funding for DEP based on $10 million from the new severance tax. But what if he doesn't get everything he wants? What will the impact of this budget be on environmental protection in Pennsylvania? Joining us at our roundtable to dig into this is John Dawes of the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, Harry Campbell of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and David Woodwell of the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. David, let's start with you. What catches your eye in Governor Wolf's first budget?
Well, I think, as you heard Dave Hess talking about before, it's audacious. I mean, there's a lot in there all over the place, but I think, and hopefully there's agreement on there in this, that there's optimism on the environmental side, that there are specifics in there, but overall, it's changes to the positive for DCNR, for DEP, for alternative energy. There are some spots with water that we can talk about, but I think overall, you see a change where we're not going to be fighting cuts this year as we have been for really a decade. And it's really going back and talking about what the improvements are for DCNR, DEP, the fact that DCNR is being taken a little bit off the dole of the oil and gas lease fund and getting some money back from the general fund. DEP is getting a bigger complement for oil and gas. Two state parks are getting bigger complements for DCNR, and there's a lot of money also for alternative energy proposals going forward. And so I think there's overall, it doesn't answer all the questions, but I think there is a lot to look at this and have some optimism.
Harry, Secretary has talked a little bit about his concern about funding for the Chesapeake Bay. You're the Pennsylvania Director for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. What are your thoughts on the budget?
Well, overall, as David had indicated, it is pretty aggressive. It does lay out some very audacious ideas. As it pertains to the environment, particularly water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, we're cautiously optimistic, but we need more specifics. What we can tell thus far is many of the programs that are vital to the implementation of pollution reduction practices on the ground, whether they be from our urban suburban communities dealing with polluted runoff issues, or our agricultural areas who are dealing with fertilizer runoff and soil runoff from their farm fields, many of those programs, as proposed, remain stable in terms of their funding. The problem is that over the last several number of years, when Pennsylvania has been under an obligation, a commitment to increase the rate of pollution reduction within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which half of Pennsylvania drains to, we've seen a stagnation or an actual decrease in the rate of implementation of pollution reduction practices. So how we get to where we need to be, where by 2017 we face a significant milestone of specific levels of practices that must be in place, how we close that gap with stable funding is the question that remains unanswered.
And John Dawes, what questions do you have?
Well, I would like to say, first of all, I'm optimistic about the budget. I think it lays out a plan that is based upon the reason that Governor Wolf won the election. It's why elections are so important. And the severance tax was a big part of the campaign. And I believe that the citizens have spoken and that we should work toward implementing a good severance tax. And I agree with Harry in terms of the difficulties in terms of meeting that midpoint assessment, which is what he was referring to in 2017, with all practices to be in place for a clean bay by 2025. Pennsylvania, I think, is woefully behind in terms of riparian corridors, in terms of abandoned mine land plantings of acres, reforestation, all of this during the midst of the shale gas boom, which requires deforestation in order to take place. So I think there's some opportunities and there are some gaps. One of the gaps that I noticed in the budget was historic preservation was left out of it. And they were a very meaningful part of the Renew Growing Greener Coalition that was instrumental in getting good environmental protection provisions in Act 13.
David, what concerns do you have about this?
Well, I think they're, building on what both Harry and John have said, DEP and DCNR have a lot of work ahead of them anyway. There is the
Clean Power Plan that DEP's got to deal with in the next year. There are the Bay issues. Chapter 78 regulations just came out recently from DEP, looking at how you regulate the oil and gas industry more. So there's a lot, as we're talking about sort of the budget and money and not necessarily talking about the exact numbers, there's a lot of work product. And I think it's also, there's a lot of exciting work product to come out of both agencies. And for DCNR, it's managing a lot of public lands that are open for various forms of extraction, I mean, timber and drilling as well, and how they manage those pieces. And so I think while we talk about the numbers, we also have to talk about what's behind those. And I think there have been commitments made to the water, to the air, to the extractive industries as well. And now it's really helping to be able to work with the agencies to really make that stuff happen.
And in fact, Acting Secretary John Quigley, Acting Secretary DCNR Cindy Dunn, and the Department of Agriculture Acting Secretary Russ Redding have all committed to working collaboratively and collectively together on water issues, particularly the Chesapeake Bay, but across the state of Pennsylvania. We have roughly 20,000 miles in the state of Pennsylvania of rivers and streams that currently do not meet water quality standards. They're considered impaired. Dealing with those is not a Bay issue, it's not a regional issue, this is a Pennsylvania issue. This is rivers and streams in our own backyard that we rely upon for our economy, for our health. Many of us get our drinking water from surface water sources, and for our quality of life. These are truly investments in Pennsylvania's future.
That's right.
And some of those investments too, with the impact fee that's already in place, and commitments from the administration to keep those programs in place for communities goes a long way. And that's a lot of money each year to conservation districts and other folks.
That's right. Yep. That's right. I'd like to interject that through my work with the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, we have an army of 300 watershed associations that are looking to this administration for some sustained funding to do reclamation work and conservation work that's in their own home watershed. So at the same time, it's the state's responsibility to support them. It's important to pay attention to federal funding, federal programs such as the Abandoned Minelands Fund out of Department of Interior, Office of Surface Mining. Right now, Pennsylvania receives $59 million a year in mandatory spending, which did not appear in that budget. I don't think AML, Abandoned Minelands, was specifically addressed. But there are opportunities, and I believe that this administration will pay attention to them. For example, in the president's budget, he has a line item called Power Plus Plan, which is to spend out the existing $1 billion that's in the AML fund at $200 million per year based upon need. Well, the need is the greatest in Pennsylvania. So if that goes through, there's an opportunity for Pennsylvania to receive more than the $59 million, which is in the statutes of the current reauthorization. Also, in that budget, I just learned recently, is $33 million for rivers and streams in the Bay watershed. And so that's another opportunity which I know they're paying attention to. And of course there's the Farm Bill, which is the source of funding for much of the work that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation advocates for and implements.
Yeah, and John, and that's the importance of the collaborative nature of not only the agencies and stakeholders like ourselves here today, but then the state and federal government as well. These opportunities to galvanize those resources to have the greatest impact on the ground are opportunities that we cannot let go by.
Well, and the reason for that, I mean, it's more than a wanton discussion about the budget and the politics of the General Assembly and the governor and everybody else. These are investments in clean air, clean water, reclaiming lands, public health, recreation, all of those things where there are really tangible benefits from this. And I think the optimism that I've got, I hope, isn't tempered too much by the realities of the political process. And I'll just say that as this goes forward, there will be a lot of discussions about things, including the severance tax, and you can debate how much impact that's got on environmental funding. But that hopefully that all sides in this will see the importance of the environmental funding and turning the corner to come back to really start
repairing some of the damage that was done to those budgets over the last number of years.
In fact, picking up on that theme of investments, we recently commissioned a study that was peer-reviewed economic analysis that looked at the result of the implementation of what is called the Chesapeake Bay Blueprint. It's basically the watershed implementation plans that Pennsylvania developed that are the roadmap to success for not only our local rivers and streams, but ultimately the Chesapeake Bay, which we have to achieve by 2017 and then ultimately 2025. The result of that economic analysis indicated that by investing in these pollution reduction practices, Pennsylvania will see over $6 billion in natural benefits returned to us as Pennsylvanians. So many folks oftentimes talk about these as expenditures or obligations that are a drag on the economy, but when we truly look at it in its truest form, these are truly investments in our communities, in our individual properties, in our health, and in our overall economy.
That's $6 billion. That's an economic, new growth, new job creation, or where are those numbers?
It's a number of things. It's increased productivity on agricultural lands because you're saving soils, for instance. You have healthier soils when you put these practices in place. When you install forested riparian buffers or put what is known as precision feeding, where you're feeding animals precisely what they need and no more, you're saving money. We see herd health improve when we put these pollution reduction practices in place. It's also cleaner air and therefore diverting the costs associated with asthma or other diseases that people have as it pertains to whether it be from the air or the water. Those tangible benefits that are avoided result in economic or natural benefits that are returned to us.
As well as economic benefits from things like trail development, land conservation, investing in communities, and really giving people an opportunity to get outside, as well as attracting the tourism that comes with so much of that from Pennsylvania, which is the number two piece of impact in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
David, you talked a moment ago about energy and climate. What the governor's proposal calls for a new energy development, particularly in renewable energy and clean energy. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact of the governor's energy proposals on air quality, for example?
Well, I think the governor's got a proposed bond issue in there with a lot of it going to clean energy. And I think, as you look at wind and solar and other pieces, and that all helps us as we look at more of an all-of-the-above energy portfolio for Pennsylvania. I mean, the use of coal is going down for a number of reasons. Natural gas, we've got a lot of it here. It's going up. The price is down at the moment. We see what happens with that. Solar and wind are still becoming greater parts of our energy mix. And I think overall, we've really got to look from a climate perspective, from a public health perspective, at how we take that long road to getting a switch to renewables, to lesser impactful energies for climate. And I think it's going to be a slow process. At one point we talked about natural gas as a bridge fuel to renewables. That bridge has gotten really long with the amount of gas reserves that are here. And now it's sort of, where's the off-ramp? How do we keep balancing the energy portfolio that we've got and reduce our emissions? And some of that's going to come out in the next year or so with DEP developing the Clean Power Plan, as it's going to be required by EPA. And I think we're going to see there how they really mix up that whole fuel source.
Yeah, during the Rendell administration, we had a grants program called Energy Harvest. And it was such that individuals, businesses, schools, townships could apply for renewable energy. And it's through that innovation and the demonstration projects that better and bigger projects can come online. So my hope is that we have something analogous to that. And in the budget, it looks that way.
And the debt service for that is proposed to be from the severance tax. So it's really
correct.
Natural gas fees going to pay for renewable investment.
Right.
And not to downplay the importance, both societally as well as globally and to our own economy, of renewable energies and this bond that the governor has proposed. But we would have loved to have seen something equivalent to, or at least near to that, in regards to water quality.
Well, there seems to be a lot of shared optimism among the three of you here. And Dave Hess talked earlier about a lot of the horse trading that's now going to get started as the budget hearings get underway. What message would you like to give to the General Assembly as they begin that horse trading about the importance of maintaining that severance tax to provide the adequate, the necessary funding for the environmental programs that we've been talking about here today?
No one can be against education, and that's a no-brainer. However, if the severance tax is coming from an extractive industry, it seems to me that a portion of that should go toward programs like Growing Greener. And it's my hope that this governor will, like Republican governors, Democratic governors before, have initiated Growing Greener. And I hope it becomes Growing Greener 3.
Yeah, Growing Greener is an integral part of a lot of things that pertain to not only pollution reduction practices on the ground, but other types of programs that people rely upon for trails and public parks and things like that. So reinvesting in Growing Greener, maintaining Growing Greener is an important component to an innovative program that at the time was nationally lauded as being so innovative, so impactful, that it was copied in many other states across the nation. So continuing that investment, continuing that legacy in Growing Greener is vitally important. But even outside of the fact that whether or not we have a severance tax, we have obligations. And in regards to the Chesapeake Bay, we have obligations with very detailed timelines. 2017, 2 growing seasons. We have to ramp up significantly what we've been doing on the ground in pollution reduction practices. So I would ask the legislature, regardless of where we are getting our sources of funding from, how do we do that? Let's work towards utilizing existing resources, prioritizing them to get the most cost-effective reductions possible, but we have to ramp up, and we need to do it now.
I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word on this subject. I'd like to thank the 3 of you for joining us, John Dawes, Harry Campbell, and David Woodwell. And I'd like to thank the students, the faculty, and staff at Point Park University in downtown Pittsburgh for their help in producing today's show. That's it for this edition of Environmental Focus. We'll be back again next month, so check your local listings for the date and time in your area. In the meantime, you can see a complete rebroadcast of this program by visiting the Pennsylvania Environmental Council website at www.pecpa.org. Until then, I'm Bob Oltmans. Thanks for joining us.